This is the second in a three-part lecture on meritocracy. It will explore the meaning of meritocracy and its development as a system of government. In this lecture, I draw from the book Benign Violence, Education in and Beyond the Age of Reason, published by Palgrave Macmillan. 4 historically contingent principles of meritocracy can be extracted from Michael Young's book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, first published in 1958. First, meritocracy requires administrative overview and the careful redistribution of human ability. Second, for administrative purposes, human ability is a relatively fixed trait. Third, competition is irrational and should be avoided. Fourth, a perfected meritocracy is one where inequalities are precisely matched to abilities. It is a society where inequalities are justly unequal. I will consider each of these principles in turn and endeavour to show how each principle reflects broader social processes and assumptions in and before 1958. I will then explore, in the third part of this lecture, how each principle was undermined, leading to a very different regime of meritocracy, which is the one that we currently occupy. So, firstly, the idea that meritocracy requires administrative overview and the careful redistribution of human ability. The idea of administering the distribution of ability and replacing patronage can be traced back to Jeremy Bentham's Constitutional Code of 1830. This was a program Bentham invented for the organisation of government. It contains the tedious details of a so-called system of official location to be used in allocating official posts. By the combination of a question book, tickets, ticket board, cylindrical box, rather like a raffle, and a non-discerning child, who would choose the questions to be asked, candidates for governmental posts would be examined and then delivered to their respective positions. Examination would bring candidates straight to their post in a way that maximised human resources and minimised cost. This was a highly mechanistic and novel system that sought to replace the vagaries of patronage with the precision of scientific allocation. In practice, patronage was first challenged in the Indian civil service when examinations were introduced in 1854, and in the Home Civil Service somewhat later in 1870. At a similar time, and following the work of Francis Galton, the distribution of human abilities throughout the population was put in question. Galton suggested that the range of mental power is enormous, and yet when you place people according to their natural abilities, he wrote, in classes separated by equal degrees of merit, the number of people in each class is far from equal. Indeed, according to Galton, the distribution of ability follows a pattern which we now refer to as a normal or bell-shaped distribution. This population-level awareness was an innovation at the time. Combined with the efforts in the civil service to replace patronage and ensure that the best man, in that case, got the job, this awareness of human ability and its distribution throughout the population suggested that all vocations might be administered in a similar way. So now, the second of the 4 principles of mid-20th century meritocracy. This was the idea that, for administrative purposes, human ability is a relatively fixed trait. The history of intelligence testing is complex, yet an overall transition can be observed from an early 20th century preoccupation with the role of genetic traits to a mid to late 20th century emphasis on environmental factors and their effect on mental development. The early association between intelligence and genetics reflects the initial connection between efforts to measure intelligence and eugenic thought, from Galton's early attempts to quantify mental power or mental energy to later work by psychologists who were sympathetic to the eugenic cause. Meanwhile, Charles Spearman advanced a theory of intelligence that suggested it was a unitary and measurable phenomenon. He labelled this supposed entity G. More detail on these developments can be found in the accompanying lecture titled Schooling, Psychometric Testing and Eugenics. The redistribution of human ability makes most obvious sense when ability is viewed as determined at birth. However, this genetic hypothesis was severely challenged following the fallout of World War II and accusations of scientific racism. Moreover, the idea that intelligence could be represented as a single entity had always been a contested theory. And yet, despite such doubts, in Young's dystopia one finds that intelligence testing is portrayed as dominant and unquestioned. This perhaps unlikely result is, Young explains, due to the predictive facility of testing. In The Rise of the Meritocracy, the proven utility of intelligence testing in predicting future success ensures the ongoing survival of psychometric techniques against any rising doubts over the exact nature of intelligence itself. In isolation, scientific doubt poses an insufficient challenge to the use of such instruments when their utility is demanded by the logic of meritocratic repositioning. Under conditions such as these, it could be assumed that for administrative purposes, intelligence is reasonably fixed, even if this assumption is open to challenge from a scientific perspective. So now to the third of the four principles of mid-20th century meritocracy. This was the idea that competition is irrational and is to be avoided. As P.J. Hartog explained in his 1911 lecture titled Examinations in Their Bearing on National Efficiency, it is important to be clear about the precise function of examinations, he said, that are used to distinguish between candidates of different merit. The competitive idea, he argued, that lingers behind notions of advance by merit can, he claimed, lead us into confusion, because the idea of competition can tempt us to forget the distinction between the efficiency of an examination and its difficulty. Very difficult examinations are likely to be highly competitive, he argued, but are they efficient, he asked. According to Hartog, an efficient examination is one that says something useful about those who pass it. This means that superior examinations are not simply those which are harder to pass. Rather, superior examinations are those devices that match people to tasks and are able to divide candidates who can perform certain predefined social functions from those who cannot. In the field of administrative efficiency, the competitive principle is inappropriate and potentially damaging. In the 1920s, the psychologist Cyril Burt went further, suggesting that competition is also associated with irrational drives. He railed against systems of vocational guidance where, he claimed, the predominating element in the choice of occupation is the wish or the whim of the parent and of the child. The average parent, he claimed, also suffers from a lack of psychological insight and cannot possibly have the range of information necessary for a satisfactory choice. Teachers often fill this gap of expertise, he admits, but the teacher is an educational, not an industrial expert, and of all the professions, his is perhaps the least in contact with the world of business, Burt writes. According to Burt, a centralized administrative machinery Making use of precise and rational techniques was required. Closer in time to the writing of Young's dystopia, these anti-competitive principles can be observed in the efforts that were made to confine grammar school examinations, known as GCEs, to grammar school children. Indeed, in the early post-war years, some educationalists felt that external examinations were fundamentally inappropriate for secondary modern schools, which catered for the bulk of the school-aged population. It was seen as impractical to combine a system of external examinations which presupposes a measure of uniformity with the fundamental conception of modern school examination which insists on variety. In this context, one general examination open to a vast range of pupils would invite undue competitive effort. It was felt, by contrast, that examinations should be qualifying rather than competitive. According to this logic, only grammar schools with relatively homogeneous populations in terms of their presumed intelligence could withstand a single external examination. In the grammar school, examination would be a qualifying procedure rather than a competitive device for siphoning upper streams of ability from a vast range of candidates. The overall post-war model for secondary schooling, according to which, after examination at 11+, pupils would be allocated to either grammar, technical, or modern schools, also denied the competitive principle. In this context, it was argued that parity of schools in the secondary stage of education was essential. Equal status would make it easier to transfer pupils, it was felt, to schools better suited to their needs, without creating any sense of slur or failure. The legacies of an age which had a different educational and social outlook from our own, it was written, that gave certain schools a prestige based on other than educational grounds must be swept away. Once established, equality of status will ensure that all schools are equally acceptable to parents and will enable allocations to those that will best develop the particular abilities of their children to be made. As the Socialist MP and Minister of Education Ellen Wilkinson argued, coal will still have to be mined and fields ploughed. What has to be removed simply, she said, is the fantastic idea that you are in a higher social class if you add up figures in a book rather than tend the land. Meritocratic administration, it seems, requires a certain amount of parity when it comes to the esteem in which jobs are held and schools are judged, to make sure that the population at large accepts its human redistributions. Vast inequalities of status are undesirable in this context because they invite undue competition. The subordinate position given to competition can be observed in Young's account, where companies were at first allowed to descend on grammar schools and universities in order to scout for the best brains. However, as so-called brain power planning was perfected, this mode of vocational positioning came to be seen as wasteful. Competition, it appears, was only necessary in earlier, more poorly administered times. Once administrative perfection was attained, the irrational drives of ambition were no longer required. Individuals would no longer be relied on to redistribute themselves. And now, the fourth and last principle of mid-20th century meritocracy. This was the idea that a perfected meritocracy is one where inequalities are precisely matched to abilities. Following Galton's extension of the statistical law of error to human phenomena, resulting in the normal distribution as we now know it, it was possible to conceive of administering a human population according to its normally distributed traits. Soon after the invention of intelligence testing, Henry Goddard classified the various grades of so-called subnormal children, a hateful term, according to their industrial capacity. Cyril Burt extended this principle in the 1920s to the entire population, suggesting that vocations were also normally distributed. it remained merely to match the bell-shaped distribution of human abilities to this normal distribution of jobs. Acting as a sorting mechanism, schooling would also divide itself according to the normal distribution. Grammar and technical schools were to take the upper section of ability. Modern schools would take the vast bulk of the so-called average and below average pupils, and special schools would take the remainder. Eventually, when an external examination, the CSE, designed to suit the needs of the modern school, was introduced, it was intended to cater for the upper end of modern school ability only. Overall, then, the differentiated provision of secondary education, the administration of qualifying examinations, and the distribution of jobs was designed with a normally distributed population in mind. So here, briefly summarised, were the key assumptions underpinning meritocratic thinking in the 1950s. In the next part, I explore how those assumptions were transformed.